There are actually a number, but I'll give you the most important. The first obstacle to global governance today is the refusal to accept that other people have moral imaginaries, that they actually have system of thought, that have consistent and coherent ethical and moral regimes embedded in them, and that they are not necessarily obsessed with the past, and that they want to look forward to a new imaginary, new ways of running the world. And I think that that's actually is mistaken, not only by policymakers in the West, but also by academics. That we think that the West, people in the non-West are only obsessed and preoccupied with reacting to the West, which is actually in my earlier book, I called that sort of the egocentrism in Europe. So it must be about us. Yes, I start with diplomacy and then I'll go to law, right? In Western traditions, and what we are taught in the West, difference is always leads to conflict. And I think, I'm Catholic, so if I read the Bible and I see, Armageddon is the crossroad where everybody meets, so it has to be a problem. Toni Morrison, when she did her Nobel Peace talk, and she said, who said that the Tower of Babel collapsed because there were multiple tongues? She said, have you ever considered whether the Tower of Babel collapsed because somebody said, my language or else? And I'm with Toni Morrison. I think because somebody says my language or else. I think that there's a sort of an impossibility to live with difference, to live in incommensurability. Things that are incommensurability in most parts of the world before Western hegemony was always an invitation for negotiation and constant figuring it out. Constant figuring it out is not actually a weakness. It simply means that you figure it out. And I think that's one problem. The other problem is actually that, especially because we are not talking today about economics, it's, I take property right. In the Sahel, in West Africa today, where you have all these conflicts, I can tell you that all the conflict in Mali and Burkina, every single one of the crises except when the terrorists came in after, the jihadis came in after 9/11, every conflict started with land reform, right? Why? Because in the Sahel, access to the resource of life did not abide boundaries. It didn't matter whether the wadi, the water source, was in your territory or it was in somebody else's territory. You had access to it. Your date trees, you had access to them. Why? Because the land dune shifts, and so you are not going to say, today, the wadi is here, it's mine, you are not going to have access to it. If the dune shift tomorrow, you don't have it, then what do? Right? How people imagine property, access, whatever, it was all very, very complicated. And then somebody comes in and said, nope, we have land regimes. And what we forget even in the West is that our land regime today are post-enclosure. Before the enclosure movement in the UK, property was not the way we imagine it today, right? So we have a lot of legal regime that actually don't make sense, and we refuse to contemplate the idea that there actually are different workable solutions around the conflict that we have today. Opening will have to come from non-state agents. After World War II, if you look at the regimes that we have, Security Council, the ideas came from Dumbarton Oaks, Yalta, Potsdam. The General Assembly, the route was slightly different. But if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not actually a treaty, which has the most pull in the world today, it was René Cassin, who was a survivor from, the drafting of Jews to, had survived that. Charles Malik, who was Lebanese Christian, and women from Mexico, and Jews from Colombia, and et cetera, et cetera. it was actually the most democratic, and we forget that after World War II, between 1945 and 1950, it was the most democratic moment in modern history, because the West had lost confidence into itself. Twice in 20 years they had world wars, right? So they were open to negotiation, and that you can see that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can find it in the Genocide Convention. You can find it in many other places. And most of the in UNESCO, most of the open forums where people actually speak on whatever sort of very openly about the future of the world are in places where there are no such power discrepancy. But right, but the Security Council is a problem. The structure of the General Assembly is a problem. The power that has is a problem. So I actually don't think that we have to remake the world. We actually know how to make things democratic, and we just have to dispense with a few things. Objective number one, Security Council. I don't think in a world in which people believe in democracy, you should actually have a few countries that are permanently right. And they also happen to be the ones that have nuclear weapons, that invade other people, and that cannot work. And I actually think that the world really has to the current moment, I think, the waning power of America before China rises, I actually think that we have a collective moral responsibility to reimagine. I think it's possible. I think that's what happened after World War II. Potsdam, Yalta, blah, blah, notwithstanding, and then the Bretton Woods institution notwithstanding. Those were the only ones that were controlled, that sort of, otherwise everything else was actually quite open. And I think that is possible, yeah. We, again, in the West, we forget that before Western hegemony, we had regional legal systems. I take just one example, the state of Malacca. Don't trust me? Read Hugo Grotius. In his debate with Freitas, the Portuguese, he's telling them, these people knew that the sea should be open. Why are you coming in and says that you are instituting a new regime of freedom, but that is not free, that is exclusionary? Right? And in the Strait of Malacca, they invented the letter of credit, not the letter of credit that as we know it today, but just documents that allow you to transact from a distance. And, you know, Muslims, Arabs, right, Chinese, South Asian, Indians, and etc., all met in the Strait of Malacca. And a Muslim merchant could come from their place, come and sell something to a European, and the European didn't have, if the European give them the money and they wanted something from Europe, they'll tell them, keep the money, but go somewhere, give them a note from me, and there's a code word, and they'll give it to you. All I'm saying is that capitalism actually became global initially through things that are intangible to us today, trust. But everybody was invested to make it work, right? They didn't know, they didn't have identity card. You didn't know where people came from. You didn't speak the language, but they managed to have these transactions. And you can see the fairs, the caravanserais, and all of these were really intangible. So the idea that we only have to have treaties, documents, seals, whatever, I actually think that what the world needs to know, to learn today, is actually knowing that things that we have learned to unlearn actually used to work. One of them is trust. And the other one is actually faith that we can work things out together, right? Diplomacy. And I know I'm running out of time, but I can tell you that for nearly 8 centuries, you could leave what is now northern Mozambique, end up in China, go through regions that were governed by Muslims, Hindus, blah, 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 and all that stuff, and come back without having an ID card, without having their currency, without having their languages, without, right? But people transacted. And I think that we have put ourselves in these, you know, strictures of, you know, law, treaty, and allies. These are my allies, those are not my allies, these are different, whatever. And I think that actually that is it to our detriment. It seemed to have been generative of certain resources, of certain juridical system that have worked for a while, but I think that they are now exhausting themselves. I think we have to rethink, right? Because all our institutions today show that nothing is working.